series for ethics. In this video, we will continue our discussion of the ethical theory of Immanuel Kant. And you should recall that one of the primary concepts within Kant's theory is this idea that to act in a morally correct way, or to be a morally good person, what that entails is following the moral law. And of course, the moral law is just his way of describing that set of rules or prohibitions that an ethically good person must follow. Things like don't lie, don't steal, don't kill, don't cheat or defraud other people, and also possibly some positive duties, such as we should help others at times. So all those rules that we think constitute what it means to act in an ethically good way, that's just what he means by the moral law. But of course, for Kant, it's not enough that you just follow the moral law. We've seen that in order to act with what Kant calls a good will, you have to not just follow the law for any reason. For instance, we talked about, well, if you're just following the moral law because it's in your self-interest, or because you have a natural instinct to do so, or because you were born with the right psychological disposition that makes it more likely that you're going to be honest, or help other people, or you enjoy being generous. If that is the reason that you're following the moral law, that you're doing the right thing, then we only say you're acting in conformity with duty. But to truly have a good will means you have to act from duty. And as Kant has described, this means you have to act with respect for the moral law. The reason you don't lie, the reason you don't cheat other people, the reason you don't steal, isn't just because it's good for you. You don't treat other people equitably and generously and fairly because it serves your interests or makes you feel good. Rather, you do so because you recognize it's dictated by the moral law. You have respect for the moral law, and ultimately you do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. But of course, even if we accept all that, that brings up another tricky question that Kant really owes us an answer on. What does the moral law actually require of us? Now, I've told you that Kant's a moral absolutist, and he even held things such as not lying is a moral absolute we must always follow. I've suggested that things like not stealing, not killing other people, these would all be in the moral law. But notice he hasn't actually explained to us where this moral law comes from. How do we know those are the things we're supposed to do? Where is he getting that from? And the way Kant puts this question is the following. He says, what kind of law can that possibly be, the representation of which must determine the will for it to be called good absolutely and without limitation? The question we began when we began looking at Kant's moral absolutism was this idea, well, how could any moral rule be absolute when circumstances are always changing? And that's the question that Kant's asking here. How could any rule be good absolutely without limitation? How do we know that we're never allowed to tell a lie, for instance? Now, in order to understand how Kant derives what are the morally good things to do and the morally bad things to do, in order to understand how he generates what the moral law tells us to do, I want to think about one specific practical instance. It could be a sort of situation that you may have found yourself in at one point. Suppose you're in a job interview for a very desirable job opportunity. There you are, sitting in the interview, you're face to face with the interviewers, and in the back of your mind, you know that there is a certain lie that if they believed it, and if you were able to get away with it, you know would greatly increase your chances of getting the job. Maybe it's something about your education, maybe it's something about your work experience, your voluntary experience, your references, whatever the case is, you're saying there's this lie which if they believed would really greatly increase my chances. And if that's the case, then the question you are confronted with at that point is, ought I lie in this job interview? Should I tell a lie in this interview? And so I want to frame it this way because I want to think about what are all the various answers and what are the different ways you could think about that question, should I tell a lie in this interview? And I want to see what Kant would say about this. So the first thing to say is that the way you would think about this is that in order to answer this question, you need to use your practical reason. So you'll recall that practical reason just is the ability we have for our reason to influence our will, for our reason to determine the choices we make and how we will act. Although other animals merely act on instinct, human beings are unique in that we can use reason to determine what we will do. And furthermore, because Kant tells us, and we've seen this previously, that everything in nature works according to laws, when you are doing this, when you're thinking about what you're going to do, what you are generating are laws or rules that you're going to follow. Right? So the whole purpose of practical reason is to generate a certain law or rule that you'll follow in this instance, and presumably that would make sense for you to follow in future instances. And these laws that practical reason generates are going to be the foundation of what Kant considers to be the moral law. Now, more specifically, these practical rules which practical reason discovers, Kant refers to as imperatives. Right? The way he thinks about it is that our practical reason generates a certain command, right? You should lie in the interview for this reason. You should never tell a lie, including in this interview. All those are sort of commands that are telling you what to do, right? Your reason is thinking about what to do, and what it produces is a command or an imperative is giving you instructions for how you should act. So he tells us the formula of the command that is produced by practical reason is called an imperative. Okay, so all practical rules are imperatives. There are a certain sort of command instructing us on what we should do. And Kant notices something very interesting about these commands or imperatives, right? He says, all imperatives are expressed by an ought. And that word ought is of fundamental importance here. And so, it may not be as common for us to use the word ought, although it's probably recognizable to you, but we also use the word should, right, to mean the same sort of thing. So every single imperative you can think of, every command you can think of, would use a word like ought or should or some word which means the same thing. So here are some examples of some imperatives. You ought to study for your philosophy exam. You should clean your room once a week. You ought not lie during a job interview. You should not kill another innocent human being. Now, those are all very different commands or very different imperatives. We might attach a different level of severity to them, but they're all similar in the sense that they all express what I'll call the ought or should relationship. They all have this sort of action or thing you're supposed to refrain from, and they say you should perform that action, or you ought not or should not perform that action. And when thinking about imperatives and thinking about the moral law, this was a fundamentally important concept to Kant. Because we can ask the question, like, what does it mean when you tell someone that they should do something? What does it mean when you tell someone that they ought not do something? How is the ought or should relationship possible? And Kant noticed something about this relationship when we use phrases like this, that you should do something or ought do something. Again, he says, all imperatives are expressed by an ought. These imperatives, he says, they say to do or omit something would be good. But they say to a will that does not always do something just because it is represented to it that it would be good to do it. So when you tell someone you should clean your room once per week, what is the content of that statement? Do you say that statement and necessarily expect that the person will obey your command? Do you see it as a fundamental rule of the universe that that person will necessarily recognize to be good? No, not necessarily. As he says here, when you tell someone they ought to do something or you should do something, you're representing that action to them as a good thing to do, but you're recognizing at the same time that they may very well choose not to do it. And this is the fundamental, essential aspect of the ought-should relationship. For the ought-should relationship to be possible, it must be possible that we're talking to or commanding a being that has reason and free choice and can choose to accept and obey or disobey and disregard that command or imperative. And to see what I mean, let's dig a little deeper into this question of how is an ought-should or should relationship possible? So Kant tells us that all imperatives express an ought or should relationship. And there's sort of three different beings that we might direct that imperative toward. On the one hand, there could be some beings that for whom it's impossible to disobey an imperative. Some beings might find it completely impossible to obey an imperative, and other beings might find it possible to do either. So let's first consider those beings for whom it would be impossible to follow or obey an imperative. And here Kant would have in mind non-rational beings. So I have a picture of a tree, which is, of course, a type of plant. I've got a kind of animal, which here we have a camel. And then I have a non-rational human being. There was a picture of my son, Mason, when I think he was about roughly 6 months old at the time. Now, when we say that it's impossible for these beings to obey an imperative, it's important that we are specific about what we mean. For instance, if you're talking to a tree and you're telling it to stop growing, well, look, there are ways you can force a tree to stop growing. You can chop it down. But if you just tell a tree to stop growing, it can't understand that imperative. It can't understand language. It can't understand the idea that it should or should not do something. It just acts according to its biological nature. So it couldn't ever possibly obey that imperative. Now, my son Mason, when he was 6 months old, for instance, I could tell him to do all sorts of things, but just like the tree in a sense, although hopefully he will, of course, advance beyond that point, but I can tell him to do all sorts of things, and he simply will not be able to obey. He can't understand what I'm saying to him, even if he could understand the language, as he is starting to, of course, now. He understands words, but he can't understand that imperative as a rule that he's supposed to follow. He can't understand why that rule should have any force upon him. And then finally, if we think about animals, you might push back. You might say, well, look, we can train animals to do all sorts of things. You take a dog and you say, sit down or roll over, and it'll obey those commands and imperatives. So how is it impossible to obey an imperative? Well, remember what's really important for Kant here. It's not just following the rules, because you can train an animal to follow rules. You can even, of course, obviously train small children, even very young children, to follow rules. I would say my son Mason, now at the age he's at, is beginning to have some sense of being able to be trained to follow rules. But remember, for Kant, it's not enough just that you have a habit of following a rule or you've been trained to follow it. What really matters is that you follow the rule out of respect for the rule itself, out of respect ultimately for the moral law. And in his view, any non-rational being, whether a very young human being, an animal, or a tree, or a plant, or an inanimate object like a rock, simply cannot understand the idea of following the rules for their own sake, of showing respect for the moral law. So the ought-should relationship will not be possible for beings such as these, for whom it is impossible to obey the imperative. Likewise, it will also be impossible for beings for whom it's impossible to disobey the imperative. And what might Kant have in mind here? What sort of being would it be that could not disobey an imperative? Well, here he talks about a perfectly good will, or the divine will. He says no imperatives hold for the divine will and generally for a holy will. Here the ought is out of place, because willing already of itself necessarily agrees with the law. If we imagine a being like God or some other holy, perfect being like an angel that can do no wrong, then you could tell them don't lie, don't steal, don't murder other people, be generous with your time, or whatever other good imperatives would apply to that being. And if they really are perfect, then the possibility of disobeying would never even be a real possibility for them. And if the ought-should relationship can only apply to beings who can either obey or disobey, well then, imperatives are also not going to apply to those sorts of beings. There has to be a real possibility not just of obeying, but of also breaking the rule. And this is why for Kant, this special relationship, this ought-should relationship, which characterizes an imperative, is only possible for human beings, or really rational beings more generally. What makes this relationship unique is it is a sort of relationship that can only be understood by a human will. A human will that at the same time, of course, can obey rules and show respect for the moral law, but also as a real choice in terms of disobeying them, in terms of doing what is wrong, in terms of doing of not agreeing or not being willing to do what the imperative represents as good. And so because human beings have that fundamental choice, the ought-should relationship is only good for human beings and only possible specifically for human beings because we have the ability to reason. So let's return to our initial scenario. You're sitting there in the job interview, you're wondering, should I lie in this job interview? You know that answering this question means you have to use your practical reason. You know that when you use your practical reason, you'll be generating some imperative that you're supposed to be following, which will tell you what to do. So how do we know what are the right imperatives? How do we use our practical reason to generate these imperatives? For Kant, this very much depends on what kind of imperative you're talking about. And one of the fundamental concepts in this video is understanding the difference between these two kinds of imperatives. So the best way to understand it is notice when you're answering this question, should I lie during this job interview? There are really two questions you might be asking yourself. Question 1, will I be able to get away with lying during this job interview? Will lying prevent me from getting the job? So let's say you want to fudge about something about your work experience. If you're asking this question, you might say, well, okay, if I want to sort of fudge the details about what I did this job, you might say, well, if they call my references, are they going to back me up on this? Is there any way I'll really get caught? Those are the sorts of questions you would be asking. And the point is, let's say you ask those questions like, no, I really can't get away with this. So the imperative you generate is the following. I ought not do an action that will prevent me from getting this job. You say, I should not lie because it will decrease my chances of getting the job. If you're asking that question, you're asking a self-interested question, and you're going to generate a certain kind of imperative, an imperative which protects and promotes your self-interest. And we do that all the time, right? In this case, you might say it's somewhat illegitimate to think in that way, but of course it's quite regular for us and acceptable and good for us to think about our self-interest, right? Where should I go to school? How will that serve me? What career path should I take? That's all fine. So we ask this kind of question all the time. But in this situation specifically, there's also another question we should ask, which you might think, and Kant does think, is more important in the question that should be guiding our actions. Is lying during a job interview a morally acceptable type of action? And if you're asking this question, then you might say the fact that, well, if I'm concerned about whether it's the morally right thing to do, I shouldn't really ask myself, will I get caught telling this lie? What I'm really asking is lying the sort of action that is acceptable or appropriate in this instance from an ethical or moral standpoint? And if you're asking that sort of question, then you'll be generating an imperative of the following sort. An imperative which would be based on the following. I ought not do an action that is inherently bad or morally corrupt by its nature. So of course, as we've said before, these two questions would presumably be on your mind in this instance. And depending on which of these questions you focus on, you're going to get a very different type of imperative. And in Kant's mind, the difference between these two questions tracks a difference between imperatives that he refers to as hypothetical imperatives on the one hand, which he distinguishes from categorical imperatives on the other. So he says all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. What's a hypothetical imperative? He says the hypothetical imperatives represent the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else that one wants. So whenever we're dealing with a hypothetical imperative, the imperative will say, you should do this action. You should eat a turkey sandwich for lunch. You should play the lottery. You should lie in this job interview. You should go out to lunch with a friend. You should do those things because it will lead to or allow you to achieve something else you think is good. On the other hand, we can also reason and use our practical reason to generate categorical imperatives. And Kant says the categorical imperative would be the one that represented an action as objectively necessary by itself without reference to another end. A categorical imperative is an imperative that says, do this, do or do not do this thing, because you absolutely must do this thing regardless of the consequences, or you absolutely must not do it. The categorical imperative doesn't say, well, you should not tell a lie because that'll increase your chance of getting the job. It says, for instance, you should not lie because there's something inherently morally wrong with telling a lie. Again, as we've seen before, doesn't matter what the consequences are. The purpose of practical reason isn't necessarily to discover the consequences of our actions. The purpose of practical reason ultimately should be to tell us what is fundamentally morally acceptable in itself, or what's morally corrupt in itself. And if you're thinking in that way, then you're using your practical reason to generate categorical imperatives. Now, I think one easier way to understand this is to look at some examples. So I had these 4 imperatives before, which I said all express the ought-should relationship. Let's return to these and categorize them as hypothetical or categorical. The hypothetical imperatives are the following. For 1, if you want to earn an A in philosophy, you should study for your exam. If you want to have a neat and tidy living space, you should clean your room once a week. Now, why are these hypothetical? Well, they each represent some action, studying for your exam or cleaning your room, as a means to the end of something else you want, of getting an A in philosophy or having a neat and tidy living space. The action in question is represented as a means to an end. But compare that with the categorical imperatives. You ought not lie during a job interview. You should not kill another innocent human being. The categorical imperative doesn't say, again, that you shouldn't lie because it'll be bad for you, bad for your family, bad for society. It says you should not lie because lying is wrong in itself. It doesn't make reference, again, to any other end. You should not kill another innocent human being. It doesn't say you shouldn't kill another innocent human being because it'll make that individual's family sad or any other bad consequence of the action. There's just something about killing in and of itself, killing another innocent human being in and of itself, which is morally corrupt and must not be performed. Now, of course, if you might rightly guess at this point that for Kant, what he thinks morality is a set of categorical imperatives. And that makes complete sense, given that he's a moral absolutist and given that he rejects consequentialism. For him, if we're talking about hypothetical imperatives, if you're reasoning in that way, that's okay in many instances, but you're not engaging in moral reasoning. Specifically, when you're engaging in moral reasoning, you're engaging in discovering categorical imperatives. Those are the ones that ought to guide us, especially in this instance where we're sort of weighing our self-interest against morality. The categorical imperatives always must be followed. Now, we can gain further confirmation that Kant believes the categorical imperative is the imperative of morality by looking at some of the further comments he makes about this distinction. So let's stick with one example. Let's stick with the hypothetical imperative. If you want to earn an A in philosophy, then you ought to study for your exam. In this imperative, we have the action of studying for the exam, which is represented as a good means to the end of earning an A. And notice some of the things he says about here. There's really 2 questions. First, why is the action good? Well, as we've said, the action in this case will be good merely as a means to something else. Studying for the exam is good as a means to getting an A. And what about the consequence? This is the more important point. Specifically, it's the more important point for why hypothetical imperatives cannot be the imperatives of morality. Ask yourself the question, the consequence of earning an A. Is that consequence necessarily good? Well, the first thing you might say is, well, yeah, for me, I'm a college student, let's say, so I'm, focused on my grades, and getting an A would be a good thing for me. But suppose you already graduated from college, and so you didn't need to worry about grades anymore. Suppose you never entered college, and you just went right into the workforce. Suppose you were completely fine with B's or C's and didn't really care about getting an A and thought you'd be able to achieve your goals just fine without an A. Can we think of a wide swath of circumstances in which, we wouldn't say getting an A is bad, but it's just not needed? And so this is the fundamental point that Kant wants to make about the end that is, or consequence that is recommended by a hypothetical imperative. There's nothing about that consequence that makes it good in itself, that makes it something that we have to attain. And in some cases, that consequence can actually be quite bad. So I like the example he gives in the following passage. He says, "The prescriptions for the physician thoroughly to cure his man, and for the poisoner reliably to kill him, are of equal worth insofar as each serves to effect its purpose perfectly." So compare the following hypothetical imperatives. If you want to cure your patient, do X, Y, and Z. If you want to poison your patient to death, do X, Y, and Z. Now, just considered as hypothetical imperatives, couldn't those be of equal value? If the advice they gave in X, Y, and Z was in fact the most efficient way of curing the patient or killing the patient, wouldn't those be good hypothetical imperatives? Well, sure. At the end of the day, the only purpose behind a hypothetical imperative is that it gives you instructions on how to attain a certain goal. So if both of those do that, then they're both equally good and effective hypothetical imperatives. But of course, from a moral point of view, we think there's a very big difference between curing someone and killing someone. We would say that the imperative that if you want to poison someone to death, you should do X, Y, and Z might be an effective set of instructions, but it's not an imperative we want people to follow. And what this shows is that hypothetical imperatives are essentially morally neutral. They might recommend that you do something that's very morally good or very morally bad. And that doesn't mean that hypothetical imperatives should never be followed or there's something corrupt about them in themselves. It just means that morality cannot be a set of hypothetical imperatives. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, as I said, because hypothetical imperatives can recommend bad things, but also, two, because hypothetical imperatives do not command everyone equally. Right? If you want to be excellent at basketball, then you should practice 5 days a week, let's say. If you want to get an A in philosophy, you should study. If you want to have a clean room, then you should tidy up once a week. But if you don't want those things, then you have no reason to follow the imperatives. But that's very different from a categorical imperative, like you should not kill. When you tell someone you should not kill, or in Kant's view, you should not lie, you're not giving them guidelines which they can think about whether they want the end goal and decide for themselves. You don't think it's sort of an optional command. You're saying, no, regardless of whether you think killing is wrong or not, you are morally obligated not to do this. It's an imperative you cannot escape. You can escape a hypothetical imperative by saying you don't care about the consequence it recommends. But Kant noticed that categorical imperatives are inescapable in this way. And that's why, in his view, categorical imperatives must be the imperatives of morality. So take the categorical imperative, you ought not lie during a job interview. There's an action that is recommended here, telling the truth, and notice that this action, as he says, is represented as good in itself, and the consequence, whatever consequence might come of that, is completely irrelevant. Kant explains, the imperative is categorical. It concerns not the matter of the action or what is to result from it, but the form and the principle from which it itself does follow. And the essential good in it consists in the disposition, let the result be what it may. This imperative may be called that of morality. The reason this is the imperative of morality is it talks about the goodness or badness of the action itself. As Kant says, let the result be what it may. And so for that reason, because it is an imperative that applies to everyone, that must be followed absolutely, this is the form that the imperatives of morality take. It's the form that the rules that constitute the moral law will ultimately take. So where does all of this leave us? The initial question was, should I lie during this job interview? We said there are two ways to look at it. One, from the self-interested point of view, will I get caught? Will telling this lie help my chances? And if you're asking that question, then you're really just asking about hypothetical imperatives, and you're not asking the moral or ethical question that Kant thinks you should be asking in the first place. So the second way, of course, you can look at is to say, when I ask this question, I'm not asking a question about self-interest, I'm asking a question about what should a human being with reason, who's concerned about acting in an ethical, moral way, what should that being do? And if you're asking that question, then you're asking a question about a categorical imperative. You're asking a question about, is the action of lying in itself morally right or wrong? Now, as I've told you, Kant does think that there's something inherently morally wrong about lying. But we still don't really have a full answer to the question of why that is. How is it possible that something could be unconditionally good regardless of its consequences? As Kant explains it, how is this possible there could be an action of this kind that would be considered as by itself evil? Evil all by itself, regardless of any consequence it produces. To understand this, we're going to have to see how Kant actually generates the imperatives that are categorical. We're going to have to see how he actually generates what he thinks our moral duties are. But that is something we will see in the next video. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.